Assalamu alaikum. Welcome. Join me in nature as we return to our study of chapter 2, verse 262, the ayah that's talking about Ibrahim. And we already did a part 1 to this, so if you didn't watch part 1, please watch that and then come back and watch this. It'll make more sense. It'll all flow together. But today, we're going to analyze a particular part of that verse because we're doing a detailed linguistic analysis of that verse, chapter 2, verse 260. So today, we're going to analyze the term al-mawtaa, which is a word that's used as a plural for those who have died. But the reason we're going to analyze that is because we want to ask ourselves the question as we study this verse. Was Ibrahim specifically asking about physical death? So in this verse he says, وَإِذْ قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ رَبِّي أَرِنِي كَيْفَ تُحْيِي الْمَوْتَى. And when Ibrahim said, my Lord, show me how you give life to al-mawtaa. He said al-mawtaa. Now, what's interesting about this is in the Quran, there's a few different plurals for those who have died. We're going to look at 2 of them in this video. There's al-mawtaa, which is used in 260, and there's amwaat, which we're going to look at some of the verses that is used in. So, are they equivalent? Allah knows best, but I don't believe they are equivalent. I believe they're referring to different things or different levels of death. And that's a beautiful thing about the Quran, that the Quran discusses life and death on multiple different levels. It's not just one thing. So, al-mawtaa, which is used in 260, let's look at a verse that it's used in. We're going to go to chapter 30. We're going to begin with verse 52 up to 53, yeah. So here in 52 he says, فَإِنَّكَ لَا تُسْمِعُ الْمَوْتَى. He says, for you will not be able to make al-mawtaa hear or listen. You will not be able to make the dead listen, but he uses the word mawtaa, the plural mawtaa. وَلَا تُسْمِعُ السُّمَّ الدُّعَاءَ إِذَا وَلَّوْا مُدْبِرِينَ. Nor will you be able to make the deaf hear the call when they turn away, turning their backs. وَمَا أَنْتَ بِهَادِ الْعُمْيِ عَنْ ضَلَالَتِهِمْ. Nor will you be able to guide the blind away from their error. إِن تُسْمِعُ إِلَّا مَنْ يُؤْمِنُ بِآيَاتِنَا فَهُمْ مُسْلِمُونَ. You will only be able to make hear those who believe in our ayat, so they are Muslimun. They are those who submit. So subhanAllah, if you look at these verses here, you see that the word al-mawtaa seems to be contrasted with the one who believes, or those who believe in our ayat, and so they are Muslimun. Because he starts off telling us, La tusmi'u al-mawtaa. You will not be able to make al-mawtaa hear. But then who will you be able to make hear? So what's the opposite? Is in tusmi'u illa man yu'minu bi ayatina fahum muslimun. You will only be able to make hear those who believe in our ayats, so they are Muslimun. So here's an indication in the Quran that perhaps the word al-mawtaa as a plural doesn't specifically refer to physical death or those who have physically died. Now, it's not clear in every ayah that al-mawtaa is not referring to physical death, but this is one ayah that could make us lean to that interpretation, that perhaps al-mawtaa are those who have died spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, through knowledge, etc. And that brings up some really interesting discussions too, because when Isa or Jesus talks about giving life to the dead, what word is used? Is it al-mawtaa or is it amwaat? It's actually al-mawtaa. He says, وَأُحْيِي الْمَوْتَى بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ. And I give life to al-mawtaa by the permission of Allah, not amwaat. Look at the difference when we look at the word amwaat. Look at how the word amwaat is used. He says, for example, in chapter 2, verse 28, كَيْفَ تَكْفُرُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَكُنْتُمْ أَمْوَاتًا فَأَحْيَاكُمْ ثُمَّ يُمِيتُكُمْ ثُمَّ يُحْيِيكُمْ. He says, how can you disbelieve in Allah? وَكُنْتُمْ أَمْوَاتًا. While you were amwaat, not al-mawtaa. You were amwaat. فَأَحْيَاكُمْ. And then he brought you to life. ثُمَّ يُمِيتُكُمْ. Then he will give you death. ثُمَّ يُحْيِيكُمْ. And then he will bring you to life again. So here, how can you disbelieve in Allah when you were amwaat, not al-mawtaa, and he brought you to life. So here amwaat seems like complete and total non-existence. How can you believe in Allah when you were amwaat? You were in a state of complete non-existence. And in another verse he says, أَلَمْ نَجْعَلِ الْأَرْضَ كِفَاتًا أَحْيَاءً وَأَمْوَاتًا. Did we not make the earth as a container, أَحْيَاءً وَأَمْوَاتًا, for the living and the dead? So look at, in a more general sense, the earth is for the living and for the dead. So amwaat seems like a wider, more comprehensive, more general term, whereas al-mawtaa seems to be more specific. And that's interesting because Ibrahim is asking, Arini kayfa tuhyi al-mawtaa. Show me how you give life to al-mawtaa, not amwat. And perhaps studying it from this angle will give us a clue as we go through this verse further. Why was the response that Allah gave him, that he told him, فَخُذْ أَرْبَعَةً مِنَ الطَّيْرِ فَصُرْهُنَّ إِلَيْكَ, take 4 birds and cause them to incline to you. ثُمَّ جَعَلْ عَلَى كُلِّ جَبَلٍ مِنْهُنَّ جُزْءًا, then place upon each mountain a portion of them, like some of the birds or one of the birds on each mountain. And people think that means to slaughter them, but it doesn't necessarily mean to slaughter them. And they think that, I believe, because they think of al-mawtaa here as just physical death. But if you think of this on deeper levels, we could see some different understandings of this. Then he said, ثُمَّ دَعُهُنَّ يَأْتِينَكَ سَعْيًا, then call them and they will come to you running. So understanding al-mawtaa here in this verse on a different level perhaps will help us unlock why did Ibrahim, or what did Ibrahim mean by this question, or at least some of the levels, and why was this the response. And to reiterate, if we look at the ideas of life and death in the Quran, we can see different levels. So for example, in another surah, which is Surah Al-An'am, chapter 6, which is going to relate exactly to 260 and the story of Ibrahim, but we're going to talk about that in our upcoming videos. He says, أَوَمَنْ كَانَ مَيْتًا فَأَحْيَيْنَاهُ وَجَعَلْنَا لَهُ نُورًا يَمْشِي بِهِ فِي النَّاسِ. He says, is then the one who was dead, and we gave him life, and we made for him a light by which he walks amongst people, right? So it's talking about spiritually dead, because he brought him to life and he gave him a light by which he walks amongst people. So obviously that verse isn't talking about physical death. So when we think about this verse 260, that's another thing we want to think about, is the fact that Ibrahim said, show me how you give life to al-mawtaa and not amwat. So stay tuned for more videos in this series. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.